Well, it's about that time. I think it's actually 2 or 3 minutes past time. So we'll go ahead and get started here in just a minute. And make sure, while everybody's going and sitting down, make sure my little clicker works. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So we're moving into a new section in Job today. A new speaker here in chapters 38 through 41. You probably saw that back on the title, but just in case, let me test it out one more time. Yeah, Yahweh, that is God, is going to speak. And I like to, a couple of y'all said it was helpful to sort of remind us of the big picture structure of the book, but to remind us of what's happened here recently. We all know about everything bad that happens to Job, and then there's the dialogue between Job and his three friends because he curses the day of his birth. He wishes he'd never been born, and the friends are shocked, and they respond to him, and there's this back and forth where, because of their worldview, this doctrine of retribution that we've talked about repeatedly, the idea that the righteous prosper without exception, the wicked are punished without exception, and since Job is suffering greatly, the logical conclusion is that he's a great sinner. So they start off advancing that thesis kind of cautiously. By the end, they're dug in, really hitting it hard. Meanwhile, Job fires back at them that, no, that's not me. That doesn't match his experience. And we know that's actually right. Job isn't a great sinner. That's not why he's suffering. But they go back and forth. Job increasingly realizes he's not going to find any answers with them, and so he turns to God, seeking a resolution to his problem. And all this culminates in that avowal of innocence that he takes in chapters 29 through 31, where he looks back at the good old days and he laments everything that's gone wrong in his life now, and then he swears this oath that he's not guilty of any sin. He enumerates some specifically, and the whole idea is to try to get God to come down and to speak to him, to force God's hand, as it were, either to come down and confront Job or else to activate those curses. But one way or another, Job wants some sort of resolution from God. And at the same time, he's trusting in God, that God is just, God is righteous, and because Job isn't guilty of any of those crimes, he believes that God is going to vindicate him. Then over the last few weeks we have this interlude where the young man Elihu speaks. He gives us an answer that's enlightened. It's progress beyond the answers of the friends, but it's still not quite right, because he admits the possibility that someone could suffer not because they're a great sinner, but to try to prod them in the right direction, to try to turn them from some sort of error. But he still is in the wrong in that he thinks Job is elevating himself too highly, that Job's problem is not that he's suffering because he sinned. Rather, he's sinning now in the midst of his suffering, in daring to question God. And we have these speeches where he lays out that thesis, and in a lot of ways it sort of prepares the way for God, because Elihu forces Job to confront this fact that, what do you really know? Who are you to question God? And this idea that he's going to have to give up his complaint. He's going to have to relent if he wants to be back in this right relationship with God. And that to God speaking that we're going to begin looking at today in a couple of speeches here. At long last, this is what this whole book has been building toward. At long last, God speaks to Job out of the tempest. And as we've said, throughout the book, with this growing intensity, Job has longed to hear from God, because one of the most overlooked dimensions of his suffering, we think about the totality of Job's suffering, we realize he's suffered physically, not only with the loss of his possessions, the loss of his family, the loss of his health. He suffered socially in that he was once this respected elder in the community. Now he's an outcast. He's a pariah. He's suffered emotionally. You can only imagine that mental state that he must be experiencing having gone through all this. And of course we see that come out a lot in his speeches. But he's also suffered spiritually. And that's one of the things we often overlook, because here's a man who's always endeavored to serve God. Now he feels alienated from God, and he doesn't understand why. So he's wanted God to speak not only to give him an answer for why all this has happened, but because he feels like there's this impediment, this obstacle between them now that didn't exist before, and he just doesn't understand why, and he wants to be back in some sort of relationship with God. And so in speaking here, God fulfills this deepest yearning that Job has had. He addresses his suffering in a head-on way. Meanwhile, the other speakers have all claimed to speak on behalf of God. They've offered their counsel as if they know God's mind, as if they can instruct Job on behalf of him. In fact, if you remember just our most recent speeches that we looked at, Elihu claims that straight out, that someone with perfect knowledge is here. I'm going to speak to you just like God would if he were here. So all that's to say that the plot of the book steadily has been building towards this, and wisely, which is what we're trying to work towards here. So the speeches that God makes here reference to those two dominant themes we saw in Job's speeches. And I know not everybody was here for the first part of the class. We saw indications of this, even in his avowal of innocence. But those of you who have been here throughout it, if you go back to the early parts, we saw two themes come up over and over and over again in Job's speeches. One was lament. He was complaining about everything that had happened to him. And the other was this increasing theme of a lawsuit, this legal metaphor that finally comes to a head in that avowal of innocence. He wants a hearing before God. And so in God giving him this hearing, that addresses that idea of the lawsuit. Here's Job's day in court right here. And in those rhetorical questions, he sort of puts him in his place, puts that lament into a greater context. And as a result of all this, one of the ways you could win a court case in the ancient world is to reduce your opponent to silence. Well, that's what happens to Job. He doesn't have anything to say. And so in the context of this courtroom imagery, this legal metaphor, God wins the case because Job doesn't have anything to answer him. But as for that lament, God delivers a word of hope, because even if Job doesn't understand what's going on, that doesn't mean God doesn't know that he's suffering. It doesn't mean God doesn't care about him. It doesn't mean that God's not in control of things. And that's the hope that Job can rely upon, and thus move forward trusting in God and his care not only of Job, but of the whole world. So we're going to look at the first speech today. Again, as I said, we're probably not going to get through all of it. Chapter 38 through chapter 40, verse number 2. We have, first of all, an introduction. Really, in a lot of ways, it's an introduction to both speeches and a challenge to Job in the first three verses. Then in this first speech, God spends really the main body of the speech interrogating him about the created order. That runs all the way from verse 4 down through the end of chapter 39, and then he concludes by extending an invitation for Job to respond, because Job had said if God were to show up, he'd answer him. Well, go ahead and answer. That's chapter 40, verses 1 and 2. But let's begin by reading this introduction, this challenge to Job in the first three verses. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me." If you remember, at the end of chapter 37, really the bulk of the end of Elihu's speech, it's several verses there, extending back even to the end of chapter 36. Elihu had praised God in the storm. He'd meditated on God's greatness as it's manifested in a storm. And now we have out of the whirlwind, or out of the tempest, or out of the storm, your translation may say, just like Elihu described. In fact, if we want to use our imagination, he could have even seen a storm out there on the horizon, and that prompted him to use that analogy, and now that very storm is rolled in, and actually that was God manifesting himself all along. Maybe it's that very storm Elihu was describing, but in any case, God answers Job. A storm often coincides with an appearance by God, a theophany, a manifestation of his presence in the Old Testament. You can see that a lot, but part of the idea seems to be that the clouds, the mist, they reveal God on the one hand because we see his power there at work, but also they help to conceal him. They help to hide him, to shroud him there in some way. Since God's appearing, you have these awesome manifestations of nature that are associated with his power. And I won't read these for time's sake, but you could go read through the Psalms and see how often God is said to make an appearance, and it's associated with a storm, with thunder in the 77th Psalm, verses 17 and 18, with dark clouds, Psalm 18, verses 9 through 12, an earthquake, Psalm 18, verse 8, with fire, Psalm 50, verse number 3. So the point of this is that these phenomena repeatedly demonstrate that God's actually present, because these are not only things that he's created, but these are stupendous demonstrations of the power of nature, and God's in control of all this. So when you see the earth shake and you see the lightning crack across the sky, you realize, okay, God is making an appearance here. But at the same time, those clouds help to shroud him, because remember what we see several times in Scripture. No one can actually see God and live. That's what he says to Moses. So the clouds protect the audience from being consumed by his glory. But the upshot of this is, if you see God manifested in a storm, you're just overwhelmed with wonder, with awe, with fear, in that sense of a healthy respect of God. So there's the whirlwind, the tempest, and it says he answered Job. The Lord answered Job, actually, it says in the ESV, and two things to note about that. One, I think it's worth noting, he addresses Job specifically. He answered Job. We've just had Elihu speaking uninterrupted for several chapters. Job hasn't said a word. And so after that interlude, the person being addressed needs to be specified. I think that's worth noting, that God's speaking to him. There's a lot of other people there, the three friends, Elihu. We've speculated that there probably were a lot of other bystanders watching all this. Even though they hear these words, the words aren't for them primarily, at least they're not to them. The words are directed to Job. God is speaking to him directly. The second thing, and this is more subtle, difficult to notice in English perhaps, but the Lord, as it says there in chapter 38, verse 1, this is Yahweh. That's what it literally is, the YHWH, Jehovah, the way we talk about him as it comes through the Latin. But Yahweh, the personal name for God, and a lot of times, of course, that appears as the Lord in the Old Testament for historical reasons we don't need to go into. You probably know something about that. But at any rate, when we've seen God referenced in the friends' speeches, it's always been El, or some variation of that. And that's just a generic term for God. But this is denoting which God we're talking about, the one God. Yahweh means I am. That's the way he revealed himself to Moses. I am what I am, or who I am. Yahweh. So this is that God of the Hebrews, the great I am, the one true God. He's the one who speaks. He personally addresses Job out of the storm. And because we haven't encountered that name before, really, that's worth noting too. Yahweh speaks, he addresses Job. And you notice he goes on the offensive. He interrogates Job. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? How do you think Job felt when God asked him that? I think this is kind of like being called on by the teacher when you're not ready. You know, you don't have an answer. I took a class at UT that I was a government minor, and the class was constitutional interpretation. And it was taught by a fellow who had a dual appointment in the law school. And all you do in this class, you just read cases, study them. It was essentially the same class that you'd take in Con Law 1 in the law school. And he said he taught it the exact same way. The only difference is he graded it differently, because in the law school you have to grade on a curve, and undergrad he didn't have to. If you really did good work, he could give you an A. Or if everybody failed, he could fail everybody too, I suppose, for that matter. But the whole point of that is, if you've ever seen any of those movies where stereotypically the professor in the law school is using the Socratic method, he just calls on you randomly to explain this, or maybe he asks you some sort of hypothetical. That's exactly how this guy conducted his class. And, we weren't law students. I was, 20, 21 years old, an undergraduate, and we've all got our name tags out there. And, he'd just be talking there, teaching a case. Mr. Perkins, what do you think about that? Just kind of. You're put on the spot, but you got to answer. If you don't come up with something, then you're going to be in real trouble, because it means you probably didn't read, and he's going to remember that. He's going to write that down. I picture Job feeling something like that, only much more so, because here God is speaking to him, and who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Job's probably mortified. I expect I would be if I were in his position. At the very least, he's cut down to size already. He's put in his place, because Job has been pondering his dilemma from many sides. He's advanced all of these hypotheticals, tried to explain to himself, make sense of why all this is happening to him. And ultimately, all of those questions have led him to question God and to wonder, how does God govern the world? Does he always govern it justly? Well, God doesn't defend himself here, because God's above defending himself to any human being. God doesn't have to answer to Job, give an account to the way he does things. And yet he still puts Job in his place, because right away, doubts cast on Job's insight. Who is this? Who are you to question me? He doesn't challenge Job's integrity. That's what the friends did, and I think that's important to note. But he challenges Job's perception. What do you know, man? That you are asking me questions. So the opening like that, who is this? Right away, that asserts God's superiority. God's obviously not literally asking for information, right? He knows exactly who Job is. He knows everything that's been going on, but he's signaling right here that he hasn't been properly represented, that his views here haven't really been put forward. And before beginning his series of questions, he accuses Job there of darkening counsel by words without knowledge. So he says Job's darkening counsel, and he's speaking without knowledge. Job lacks insight into the counsel of God. That is, he doesn't understand the way that God governs the world. He doesn't understand the wisdom that he employs in doing that. And of course, that's what God's going to try to bring out in the rest of this speech. At times, what we've seen is that Job gets close to the truth, trusting that God is governing it wisely and saying that there are things beyond his comprehension, but then we see him just as quickly, if you go back to those earlier speeches, he falls into despondency, into despair. And I think this all speaks to his emotional state, because Job's suffering, and we shouldn't expect him necessarily to think clearly. But that's why he talks about him darkening counsel. It's used just the same way Elihu had actually used that term back in chapter 37, verse 19. Teach us what we shall say to him. We cannot draw up our case because of darkness. It's used to speak of ignorance. So Job darkens counsel because he doesn't fully understand God's ways. And it's darkest when he assumes that he could dispute with God as an equal, when he has this standing to go and to question God directly like this. Now, it's important for us to note, I alluded to this already, and I want us to mention it now, even though we won't get here for a couple more weeks. We might think that this stands in tension with what God says about Job at the very end of the book, chapter 42, verse 7. After God's delivered his two speeches, he says to Eliphaz, the ringleader of Job's friends, "My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." So on the one hand, God says there, Job has spoken rightly. Here he says he's darkened counsel by words without knowledge. How do we bring those two things together? I think what we have to realize is that Job, through all his questioning, through all his uncertainty, we talked about his suffering, emotional, spiritual, physical, social, but it was never insincere, and it was never turning away from God. Job never rebelled against God. He didn't turn against God. He didn't curse God the way that his wife said, and he didn't repent the way that his friends told him to just so he could get something out of God. Instead, even though he doesn't understand, he's pushing through all of that with faith in God. He's calling God in against God, really, throughout much of this book. He doesn't understand why this is happening, doesn't understand why God's afflicting him, at least in his mind, but he knows, he's still confident that somehow God's the only one who can make it right. And in all of that, he's correct. He is trusting in God. It's just that his whole experience is causing this doubt, this despair. So it's about pushing through despite the emotional turmoil, despite the suffering, and continuing to rely on God and think that he is going to make everything right in the end. That's how he's been right, even if he lacks complete understanding. He hasn't fully perceived God's justice, and that's what's missing here and what these speeches are all about. But I think I bring up this tension now because this is worth noting. Even though Job doesn't understand, even though Job lacks insight into the way God's governing the world, God never says that Job sinned. In fact, there at the end, it seems that the friends did sin, and in fact, Job has to pray, he offers sacrifices for them, but he never says that Job sinned. He never rebukes Job for swearing that avowal of innocence. Job's made some mistakes. He's limited in his understanding. He's erred, we could say that. But God doesn't ever accuse him of sin. And I think that's not only instructive for understanding the book, but that should be comforting to us. Because if Job's problem is he's spoken words without knowledge, we all speak words without knowledge. There are a lot of things none of us understand, especially when it comes to the things of God, even if we're talking about Scripture. Scripture's true. It's profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, instruction, righteousness, etc., as Paul says, but we still have to understand it rightly. We still have to interpret it rightly and apply it rightly, and we don't necessarily always do that. I'm not saying we do it wrongly, but I'm saying we're human. We don't always know. And in fact, we don't always know that we're misinterpreting it, because if we did, presumably we'd interpret it rightly. So you're talking about the limits of human knowledge here, the unknown unknowns. We just don't even know what we don't know sometimes. But my point is, if speaking without knowledge, if a lack of understanding of God was in itself a sin, we'd all be in trouble, because there's a whole lot we don't grasp. And God tries to instruct Job as a teacher. He tries to get him to retract these things that he said that were wrong ignorantly, but he doesn't ever accuse him of sin. And I think that's a good practical lesson for us. Job's been convinced all along that he's innocent, that he hasn't committed any sort of great sin the way that the friends have accused him of, and it's that conviction. And he's right. That's not why he's suffering. In fact, the whole reason he is because he's been held up as blameless and upright. It's that conviction that's allowed him to persevere throughout all of this, to continue to trust that God's not going to abandon him in the end. He's going to set things right. But the danger of that is it can lead to pride, right? If you think that you're innocent, that you're blameless, well, eventually you can get pretty full of yourself here. And so God, I think for that reason, opens here with this rebuke, trying to put Job in his place right from the outset, because in the end, to come out on the other side of this, to learn the lesson from all of this, Job has to completely submit to God and basically admit that he's ignorant, admit that there's things that he doesn't understand, admit that there are things that he's never going to understand, and yet trust in God despite that. And so God's opening here by kind of putting him in his place, cutting away that pride that would prevent him from ever yielding, and realizing that submitting to God is the only proper resolution to all this, to be reconciled to God. And so God really sort of accepts Job's challenge. Dress for action like a man. If you have a King James version or some older translations, it says, gird your loins. That's one of those good old phrases that we don't really know what that means anymore. It's sort of proverbial. Gird up your loins. But dress for action, the ESV says, which gets to the idea. Girding your loins, that's literally, if you're out there working, you take the long skirt of your robe and you tuck it into your belt that you're wearing around the waist, so that obviously you can move about more freely here. You don't have anything obstructing you. It symbolizes here, you got a hard task ahead of you. You need to get ready for it. You need to prepare for it. God's going to ask some questions of Job and expect him to answer it. Job had actually said this earlier when he starts to ponder this idea that maybe he can speak to God directly. Back in chapter 13, verse 22, he says, call and I will answer, or I shall speak and you answer me. So God's accepted that challenge. All right, you've said that if I'll speak, I ask you some questions, you'll answer. Here it is. I'm going to lay it on you here, man. I've got some questions for you, and you're going to need all of your wit and all of your wisdom to reply. And that gets us into the body of the speech. And I don't think we're even going to make it as far as I hope today, but that's because so much of this introductory part here, I think, is so important for understanding it. The bulk of this speech, really the speech in its entirety, but we're going to divide it up into some smaller chunks to think about it more manageably, but these are questions about the way God, about the created order, the way that he made it in the first place, but then the way he continues to oversee it, to manage it, to superintend it. So in this first speech, God considers creation and he considers his maintenance of it. And we see God presented as both the creator and then as Lord. That is the one who made everything in the world, but also the one who continues to rule over it, to oversee it. So in the first part here, what we are going to look through, as creator, he establishes the earth on a secure foundation. That's verses 4 through 7. He bounds the sea, verses 8 through 11. He created light, verses 12 through 15. He knows the recesses of the deep, verses 16 through 18. He knows about the distant horizons, the places where light and dark dwell, verses 19 through 21. He knows the storehouse of snow and hail, verses 22 through 24. And then as Lord, he continues to manage, to oversee all of that. All the elements in heaven, verses 25 through 38, and then all the creatures on earth, which is the end of chapter 38, and then all of chapter 39. This speech consists of dozens, question after question after question about the created world. And naturally, Job had said, if God speaks, I'll answer him. So God says, get ready. And if you remember, Job can't answer any of these. When we get to the end, he doesn't even try to answer any of these. But that's the point. The point of this is not to literally seek information. This isn't like God playing some sort of cosmic Jeopardy with Job where he's trying to get answers out of him. It's to try to impress Job with the fact that there is a whole lot that is beyond your comprehension, that God operates in a realm that is far above our ability to understand his power, his creativity, his omniscience. We're finite, and we just simply do not have the ability to grasp all of that. But hopefully, not only like Job certainly did, but with our reading and our studying through this, we can get just a little window into that, just an inkling of insight into that, and it can help impress us with his greatness, his wisdom, his power, and our weakness and our insignificance in comparison. I think that's something that's profitable for all of us if we think about our relationship with God. And one more thing we should remember, not only for this week, but going through God's speeches next week and probably the following week too. Remember, I know I've said this before, this is poetry, all right? It's so important to remember that in God's speeches in particular. This is poetry. We can't take what's said here literally. It's not even attempting to be literal. And if we start taking it literally, we're going to run into problems. And I've seen that not only from those trying to defend the scientific foreknowledge of the Bible, taking some of this literally, but critics pick and choose verses out. They say, aha, look at this. Look what God supposedly thought about the world. They'll pull this out of context. No, we can't do that here. This is poetry. So don't press the details too literally. Think about it the way that you would a poem. Think about the big sense of it. But God questions Job really on 2 points: his structure, his maintenance of the world, that's really down through verse 38, and then his care for the animal world in particular, verse 39 through all of chapter 39. And we're going to subdivide it here into smaller chunks to make it a little more digestible. The first real section here has to do with the fundamental structure of the world, verses 4 through 15. And in a lot of ways, this sort of mirrors the structure we see in Genesis chapter 1. God kind of goes through it in the same order here. But we have a few different metaphors, a few different images that are used. So, first of all, like a master builder, God planned and laid the earth's foundation, verses 4 through 7. Like a midwife, he brought forth the sea, verses 8 through 11. Like a general, he commanded the light to shine, verses 12 through 15. Those are the images that we need to keep in mind here. But let's read this first one. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? So Job has questioned God's oversight, his rule of the world, and so God starts off here by asking him if he even understands how the world works. He starts with the very foundation of creation. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. The idea of understanding here is to know something fully, to know it completely. And the sense is that Job would have had to have been there, to have been an eyewitness, to seen it firsthand, to be able to have full understanding. In fact, I won't read this for time's sake. I hope we'd have a little more time, but I'll just reference this to you if you want to go and read it yourself. Look at Proverbs chapter 8, verses 22 through 31. You'll see there that wisdom was present when God created the world. And we see that same thing back in Job chapter 28. It talks about their wisdom was present when God created all the world. We need to pursue after wisdom. That's one of the themes of the book. Wisdom witnessed God's creation, but Job didn't. Job wasn't there. So how can you dispute this? And he talks about the formation of the earth in particular. And I mentioned this already, that the imagery here, the metaphor, it's of a master builder. This is of a big construction project going on. You notice that the site was surveyed carefully there in verse number 5. Remember, it's poetry. But the measuring line was stretched out. There was a blueprint by which the world was constructed, and you know, the whole idea of this metaphor is that God planned everything out perfectly, and it was constructed according to that plan. But who checked the plan? Who stretched out the line to make sure that everything was measured properly? Did Job? Nope. Not you, Job. That's the implication. He wasn't there. The bases were sunk, or the pillar was set, depending on what your translation says. But the whole idea is, you know, those columns. We're talking about the things here that support a roof, essentially. And then the earth's cornerstone was laid. In the ancient Near East, really just like it was even in our own world up until, a little more than a century ago. You're building a major public building, you'd lay the cornerstone, and there'd be a big celebration over that, some sort of public festival. Well, that's what we're referencing here. The cornerstone was laid. Who did that? How were the bases sunk? For the earth, the morning stars and the angels sang together. That was the big party, the celebration that was thrown when the cornerstone was laid, but no man was present. Then we have questions concerning the origins of the sea, and I mentioned already that the metaphor here is as of a midwife, verse 8. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far shall you come, and no further, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. In the ancient Near East in general, and really a lot of the Mediterranean world, even going into the days of the New Testament, but you see this in the Old Testament also, the sea is often symbolic of hostile, chaotic forces opposed to God. We've talked about that before in some other context. If you're in our Acts class, we talked about there at the end of Acts, Paul makes this journey on the sea and how the idea is that the sea is symbolic of forces opposed to God. We talked about that even a little bit in some of our sermons in Mark when the disciples are there out on the sea, and the whole idea that Jesus can calm the sea, that shows his divine power. Well, several Old Testament texts affirm the fact that God is the master of the seas. He harnesses it, he does its bidding. But what's different about the God of the Bible, and I mentioned this common idea that the sea is hostile, it's chaotic. There are a lot of ancient Near Eastern myths in other cultures. We find this in Babylon. We find this in Ugaritic, among other places. There are these myths of a cosmic battle between a sea monster and the god or the goddess who tames it, who harnesses it here, and that's how they won the right to rule. But you notice the difference here? God doesn't battle the sea. He doesn't tame the sea. Instead, the sea is an infant in submission to God from the very beginning. At the end of its time in the womb, it burst forth. That looks early by both my watch and that clock. I'm going to finish this up. At the end of its time in the womb, it burst forth. God doesn't need to subdue the sea because he planned it in the first place. And in fact, he took care of it gently, like an infant. He switches up the metaphors then, and he made natural boundaries that it couldn't cross, verses 10 and 11. He set it behind doors, just like in a prison. He fully controls it, restricts it. Just to finish off this section real quick, verses 12 through 15, the final image that's used here. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken. Darkness is associated with evil. We know that commonly. Light with life, with things that are good. And at the very beginning, on the first day, what's the first thing God does? Let there be light. He commands it into existence. And the whole idea, the sense is God continues to do that each day. You done that, Job? You know anything about light? And in fact, we have that imagery there of the wicked loving the darkness, they hide in that, and Job has questioned God's justice, but the sense is, hey, don't think just because they're hiding now that they can hide forever. God's inscribed limits for light and for darkness, and ultimately he's going to judge those wicked never move outside of his control. We'll pick up there next week. We'll look at that next big section where we look at some of those more secret places of the world, the recesses. Obviously, we didn't get quite as far as I thought, but read this on your own time if you want to. There's just so much great, rich material in this, and I want to take our time going through it compared to those Elihu speeches because there's just so much that's important in here for understanding the book and understanding God. We'll stop there. Thanks for your attention this morning.